Bonjour class, today we're learning about two pronouns called y and en. It can be slightly confusing at first, but it's really meant to make your life simpler. So if you pay attention and stick with it, I promise it'll help you out. By the end of today's lesson, you should be able to answer the following questions. You should know what is a pronoun, what is a pronoun y, what is a pronoun en, and how do you use both pronouns in one sentence. So let's start off with asking ourselves, what is a pronoun? Because this will make no sense in French if we don't know it in English. A pronoun is a word that takes the place of a noun. So a noun is a person, place, or thing. A pronoun is a word that replaces that noun. Not that it gets rid of its place in the sentence, but it just is a simpler way to refer to something. So for example, in English, common pronouns I, you, she, they. These refer to people without necessarily mentioning them by name again. So how do we use them in English? We really use them to simplify it and to not need to repeat a person's name over and over. So for example, if I am writing about Michael Phelps, which of course you all know never happens, but just if I were, I could say Michael Phelps is the best swimmer in the world. He has won more gold medals than any Olympic athlete in history. This use of the pronoun here, he, makes my life a little easier because that way I don't have to keep repeating Michael Phelps, Michael Phelps, Michael Phelps. I replace the second one with the pronoun he. And that still keeps his place in the sentence, and it refers to a noun without needing to repeat the name over and over again. So this will be very helpful in French, because we don't always repeat the objects in English. We say it, that, there, he, she all the time. And as long as we've already mentioned the thing that we're referring to, it's okay to use a pronoun because we'll understand what's going on. So we're going to learn about two of these new pronouns. If you think back to last year, we learned about direct object pronouns and indirect object pronouns, how you could say it with like le, la, les, or you could say him with lui, stuff like that. We're going to be learning two more today. So let's start with our first one, the pronoun y. It is the letter Y, but it is pronounced e. And the pronoun y most commonly replaces a preposition referring to a location and the location to which it refers. So if you have a phrase that talks about where something is located, that's the most common use of the pronoun y, is to replace that phrase. So when I say preposition referring to location, I mean, for example, à, since that means to or at. Chez, where, for example, if you say chez moi, that means my house. Chez ma sœur, my sister's house. Dans means in. En can also mean in. We talked about this last year. Dans is more literally. En is more in terms of like, je suis en Californie, I'm in the state of California. And sur, on. So for example, I could say, mon livre est dans mon sac à dos. My book is in my backpack. So if we're going to try to replace part of this sentence with the pronoun y, we need to first find the phrase that we're going to replace. And we know that y replaces a preposition referring to location, so that's dans, because that's the preposition in, and the location to which it refers. And in this case, the location is my backpack, since that's where my book is. So we can replace part of this with the pronoun y, and we've already figured out that's the phrase that we get rid of. And we change it, the y goes before the verb, the pronoun goes before the verb. So mon livre y est changes it from my book is in my backpack to my book is there. It's a lot simpler. Now in terms of the usage of this, of course you can't always use pronouns because if you say my book is there, my desk is here, people won't always know what you're talking about. But if you've already said my book is in my backpack, you can say my book is there, because that way we already know what's happening. A second use of the pronoun y is to replace the object of certain verb phrases that end with a. So we learned a as a preposition of location. So sometimes if you have a verb like penser à, to think about, réfléchir à, to reflect on, s'intéresser à, to be interested in, or répondre à, to respond to, you can also replace part of that with the pronoun y. So for example, j'ai répondu à mon professeur. So in this case, we're going to look for the preposition, which is à, and then that thing that it's referring to, which is mon professeur. So here we have, I responded to my teacher. If we're going to replace part of this with the pronoun y, we know that we cross that last part out that says à mon professeur. And then we can rewrite the sentence more simply with a pronoun by saying j'y ai répondu. I've responded to him or to her. I know that last year we learned lui is the pronoun for him or her. Most of the time that's true. The only time where it's not true is if you have this verb with the preposition a. If you see the preposition a and you know that you're using a pronoun, you're 99.9% certain that it's going to be the pronoun y that replaces it. So that's the pronoun y. Location, and then pretty much verb phrases that end with a accent grave. So then what about the pronoun en? Pronoun en replaces a phrase that begins with de or any related indefinite article. So we'll remember that indefinite articles are articles that don't refer to a specific object or a specific amount. So some, one, many, stuff like that. So if you see de or any of its variations, de la, du, des, de le, apostrophe, that can be replaced with en. So the preposition y usually refers to location. The pronoun y refers to location. The pronoun en usually refers more to a quantity or an amount. So in this case, you could say nous avons des devoirs. So we're going to look for the phrase that we replace with the pronoun. In this case, that phrase would be whatever follows the indefinite article. So we're going to replace des devoirs, and we can simplify it by saying nous en avons. So instead of saying we have homework, we have some. So we can see the pronouns are more likely used in response to a question. So like if I asked you, do you all have homework? It'd probably be kind of weird to you in English to say, yes, we have homework. You'd probably just say, yeah, we have some. And that's what you're learning to do in French right now. Nous en avons, we have some. The pronoun en can also be used to replace an object that follows a number. But if you're talking about an expression of quantity like beaucoup de, or a number like 1, 2, 3, 4, you always keep that number, you only replace the object. So for example, you could say Michael Phelps a 22 médailles olympiques. So in this case, it only replaces the object that follows the number. We don't get rid of the number itself because otherwise what's the point of the sentence? So then I could say Michael Phelps en a 22. So he has 22. And again, this only makes sense more or less if there's already context in a paragraph or if you're answering a question. Because if I just tell you Michael Phelps has 22, you don't know what I'm talking about. So if you ask me how many medals he has, I could say Michael Phelps en a 22 or something like that. And that's more common usage for the pronouns. Sometimes you get to have a ton of fun and use both in one sentence. So let's take a look at how that works. If you have a sentence that you can replace y and you can use en, which it does happen, it's not that uncommon, they always go next to each other, so they're not separated by anything else, and they always go in the order y, en. If it helps at all, I remember a French teacher I had in high school said that it sounds like a donkey that goes y, en, so silly as it is, that'll probably stick with you since it's stuck with me that many years. So for example, let's work through a sentence. And just like in math, when your teachers ask you to go step by step and not just try to solve the whole problem at once in one glance, we can do the same thing in French. So there are going to be two places where we replace phrases in the sentence with pronouns, but we can go one at a time. We don't need to just dive right in and do both at once. So j'ai 2 livres dans ma salle de classe. So here we can already see we have an expression of quantity because we have an object that follows a number. And we also have an expression of location because we have the preposition of location, dans, and then a place. So let's start by getting rid of the quantity. So instead of j'ai 2 livres, think about which pronoun we use to replace an object that follows a number. And we can simplify the sentence firstly by saying Jean est 2 dans ma salle de classe. So it changes from saying I have 2 books in my classroom to I have 2 in my classroom. And then we can get rid of dans ma salle de classe, and we get an even more simplified sentence saying j'y en ai 2. So I have 2 there. The order of the words in French doesn't match how we would translate it in English. So when I'm translating these, of course, it would mean I there have 2, okay? But that's not how we'd say it in French. So that's why my translation seems a little bit out of order. So that's the way that you can use both in one sentence. The easiest thing to do whenever you're working through problems like this is to find if there's any expressions of location, circle those, find if there are any expressions of quantity, circle those, and then go through and replace them. The e and the en will always go between the subject and the verb, like in all the examples that we've looked at today, so feel free to look at those as you're trying to refer to your class notes to complete the activities for these pronouns. And that is the end of that lesson. Hopefully you can answer the questions that we talked about at the beginning, and good luck with all of your exercises.